I was 23 years old when I realized my mother had been singing a coded message to me every single night of my childhood, and I almost fell off my chair when I figured it out. The lullaby had always seemed strange. The melody was beautiful, soothing, exactly what a lullaby should be. But the lyrics never quite made sense. They were nonsensical in that way children's songs often are, a mix of invented words and half-remembered phrases that seemed to belong to no recognizable language. "Ember, ember, light the way," the chorus went. "3 bells ring at break of day. Cornerstone and willow deep, secrets safe while children sleep." My mother had sung it to me nearly every night until I was 13 years old. Even after I was too old to ask for lullabies, I'd hear her singing it softly in the kitchen, or humming it while she did dishes. It was the soundtrack of my childhood, as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. But everything changed the day I found the old journal. I was helping my parents move to a smaller house, clearing out the attic, when I found a leather-bound journal tucked beneath some old boxes. It was my mother's handwriting, that distinctive, careful script I'd seen on shopping lists and birthday cards my entire life. The entries were dated from 40 years ago, before I was born, before she even met my father. The first entry I read made my blood run cold. I have to remember everything. I have to encode it somehow, in case I forget, in case someone finds out, in case he comes back. My hands were shaking as I kept reading. The entries were fragmented, traumatic, written in the kind of shorthand that comes from trying to document something too painful to fully articulate. And then, halfway through, I found it. The lullaby, written out in full with annotations beside each line. "Ember, ember, light the way." Time of day he took me. Early morning before dawn. 3 bells ring at break of day. 3 men involved. I only saw one clearly. Cornerstone and willow deep. Location. The house had a distinctive cornerstone. Willow trees by the property line. Secrets safe while children sleep. Keep quiet. Don't tell. It will be our secret. The room started spinning. I sat down on a dusty box and read through the entire journal, my heart pounding harder with each page. My mother had been abducted when she was 18 years old. She'd been taken from her car at a gas station and held somewhere for 6 hours. When she escaped, she was traumatized, ashamed, and terrified of reporting it because her abductor had threatened that if she told anyone, he'd come back for her family. Years later, when she became pregnant with me, she made a conscious decision. She would encode the details of her assault into a lullaby and sing it to me every night. Not to traumatize me, but to preserve the memory in case something happened to her. In case she needed to pass on these details someday. In case she needed evidence. She'd turned her trauma into a secret message, hidden in something as innocent and beautiful as a mother's lullaby. I sat there in that dusty attic for hours, holding the journal and crying. Crying for my mother, for what she'd endured, for the strength it must have taken to sing that lullaby night after night while keeping that pain locked inside. Crying for myself, for growing up with this encrypted trauma woven into my bedtime routine without knowing it. I called my mother downstairs. She was in the living room, wrapping up picture frames for the move. When she saw my face, she knew. She just knew. She sat down slowly, like her legs couldn't hold her up anymore. "You found it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you encode it into a lullaby and sing it to me like it was just a regular bedtime song?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I needed someone to know," she finally said. "But I was also terrified. If I told you directly, it would hurt you, it would make you afraid. But if I encoded it, if I made it beautiful instead of traumatic, then at least the information would be safe. At least it would be preserved. And when you were old enough, you'd find it and you'd understand." "Understand what?" I asked. "That I grew up being sung a trauma lullaby every night? That my mother was assaulted and I was the repository for her secret message?" "No," she said, and her voice was so firm, so clear. "That you grew up knowing, deep in your bones, that you were protected. That no matter what happened to me, I had already made sure that someone would know the truth. That I would never be silenced. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't know how to reconcile my anger with my understanding, my confusion with her incredible act of maternal protection. "Did you ever report it?" I asked. She shook her head. "I was too scared, and by the time I felt brave enough, it was too late. Too much time had passed, but I never forgot. I never let myself forget, and I made sure you wouldn't forget either." "But I didn't even know I was remembering," I said. "I didn't know what those words meant." "Your subconscious did," she said. "Every time I sang that lullaby, I was reinforcing something deep inside you. The knowledge that your mother had survived something terrible. That she was still here. That she was still strong enough to tuck you in at night and sing you to sleep. I was teaching you resilience through melody." I left her house that day with the journal and a head full of questions. Over the following weeks, I did research. I tried to find records of abductions in our area from that time period. I looked for news articles, police reports, anything that might corroborate what my mother had written in her journal. I found some possibilities, cases that matched the timeline and location, but nothing definitive. Nothing that would have made her abduction officially part of the public record. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that my mother had survived, that she'd turned her trauma into a song, that she'd given me, her daughter, the gift of knowing her truth, even if I didn't understand it at first. The moment my family brought Buddy home from the shelter, he walked straight to me, sat perfectly, and waited. Not for a command, not for a treat. He just sat there, staring into my eyes with this intensity that made my 7-year-old heart skip a beat. My mother laughed and said, "He's already bonded with you." But I knew it was something more, something stranger, something that felt like a secret the dog was keeping. 3 days later, something happened that changed everything. I was in the backyard playing alone, building a fort out of pillows and blankets, when I heard my father calling from inside the house. "Marcus, Marcus, come here. Marcus, come." I froze. The only people who called me Marcus were my teachers and my grandparents. At home, everyone called me Mark. My friends called me Mars. Nobody called me Marcus. But Buddy did. Or rather, Buddy responded to Marcus like it was the most natural thing in the world. He came running from across the yard, ears perked, tail wagging, and sat perfectly at my father's feet. A trained sit, the kind you see service dogs do. My father looked confused. "That's weird," he said. "The shelter never mentioned he was trained." I remember standing there, my 7-year-old brain struggling to make sense of it. How did Buddy know to respond to Marcus? My parents had just named him Buddy 3 days ago. They'd never told him my name. I was certain of that. That night, I asked my mother about it. "Did you tell Buddy my real name?" She gave me a strange look. "Your real name? Your name is Marcus, honey. That's what the shelter has on file. That's what the adoption papers say." I felt something twist in my stomach. "But you call me Mark." "At home we do," she said. "But your full name is Marcus. We've always called you Mark since you were a baby, but your official name is Marcus." I'd never thought about it before. My full name had always felt like something that existed outside my actual life, like a word in a book that someone else wrote. But Buddy knew it. Somehow, this dog knew my full name before I fully understood what it meant. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other things. Buddy didn't just respond to Marcus. He seemed to understand hand signals. When my dad held up 2 fingers, Buddy would sit. When he made a subtle gesture near his ear, Buddy would tilt his head and listen intently. These weren't commands anyone had taught him, or at least not anyone in our family. I became obsessed. I'd spend hours watching Buddy, trying to figure out who had trained him and why. The shelter paperwork said he was a mixed breed, approximately 5 years old, surrendered by an owner who couldn't care for him anymore. There were no details about his training, no indication that he was anything special. But he was special, and I knew it. When I turned 8, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I went through my parents' filing cabinet, something I wasn't supposed to do, and found the shelter paperwork. The adoption date, the vet records, the shelter ID number. And there, in the previous owner section, a name. Dr. Eleanor Reeves, an address I didn't recognize, a phone number that had been crossed out. I stared at that name for hours. Dr. Eleanor Reeves. She'd trained my dog to know my name. But how? How could she possibly know my name before my parents had even brought Buddy home? I asked my mother about it casually one afternoon while we were cooking dinner. "Hey, Mom, do we know anyone named Eleanor Reeves?" She froze. The wooden spoon she'd been holding clattered into the sink. "What?" I asked, confused by her reaction. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked, her voice tight and strange. I saw it somewhere," I said, not wanting to admit I'd been snooping through files. She turned away from me, gripping the counter. "We don't know anyone by that name," she said, "and I don't want you asking about her again." "But," I said no, she interrupted, and there was something in her voice that made me stop. Something scared, something protective, something final. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to Buddy snore softly from his dog bed next to my door, and I wondered about Dr. Eleanor Reeves. Who was she? Why had my mother reacted so strongly to her name? And most importantly, why had she trained Buddy to know my full name? The questions festered inside me for years. Through elementary school, through middle school, I kept the mystery of Dr. Eleanor Reeves locked in the back of my mind. But Buddy remained, a living mystery, responding to my full name with perfect obedience, sometimes doing tricks I'd never taught him, sometimes seeming to understand things I hadn't said out loud. When I was 14, my mother got sick. Nothing serious at first, just a cough that wouldn't go away. But then the cough got worse, and there were doctor's appointments and hushed conversations in the kitchen that stopped whenever I walked in. One night, I heard my father on the phone in the living room. "I don't care if she said not to contact her," he was saying. "She needs to know. Our son needs to know." I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding. Who was he talking about? Who needed to know what? "Eleanor, please," he continued. "He's 14 now. He's old enough to understand. He's figured out so much already on his own. And if something happens to me or Sarah," I felt the world tilt beneath me. Eleanor. My mother's name wasn't Eleanor. That meant Dr. Eleanor Reeves. My father was talking to her. About me, about my mother being sick. I made a decision that night. When my parents were asleep, I took the adoption paperwork from the filing cabinet again and copied down the address. Then I did something I'd never done before. I used my parents' computer to search for information about Dr. Eleanor Reeves. I found her within minutes. She was a child psychologist. She worked at a private practice across town, and her credentials page included a photo. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, and when I saw her face, I felt something shift inside me. I didn't know why, but I recognized her. Not from memory, but from somewhere deeper. From instinct. From the same place that made Buddy recognize my name. I printed out her information and hid it in my desk drawer. For weeks, I carried those pages with me, wondering if I should do something with them. Wondering if I should confront my parents. Wondering who this woman was and what connection she had to me and Buddy. The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon when my mother collapsed during lunch. She fell just like that, and the ambulance came screaming up to our house. I was at school when it happened, but I remember the vice principal pulling me out of class. Remember the careful way she told me. Remember the way my legs stopped working and I had to sit down. My mother had a heart condition she'd never told me about. A serious one. She needed surgery. She might not survive the surgery. I drove myself home after school. I'd just gotten my learner's permit, and I did something I'd never done before. I called the number on the information I'd printed out. Dr. Eleanor Reeves answered on the third ring. Her voice was warm, professional, exactly what I expected from a child psychologist. "Hello," I said, my voice shaking. "Is this Dr. Reeves?" "Yes," she said. "Who is this?" "My name is Marcus," I said. "Marcus Chen, I think you know me." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could feel the weight of whatever secret she was carrying. "How did you get this number?" she asked quietly. "My dad was talking to you on the phone," I said. "He said my mother was sick. He said something about me needing to know." Another pause, longer this time. "We should meet," she said finally. "Not over the phone, not like this, will you? Would you be willing to meet me?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. "Yes," I said. "I want to know who you are." "I'll come to you," she said. "What's your address?" I gave it to her. And then I sat on my bed next to Buddy, who seemed to sense my anxiety and put his head on my lap. I ran my fingers through his fur and whispered, "You know, don't you? You've known all along." Dr. Eleanor Reeves arrived at my house an hour later. I met her at the door and my instinct was confirmed. I did recognize something in her face, something in the curve of her jawline, something in the color of her eyes. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I can't believe how much you've grown." "Do I know you?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not really. Not yet. But I've known you since before you were born." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" She glanced at Buddy, who had come to greet her with that same perfect sit he'd given everyone. "Can we sit down? This is a long story." We sat in the living room and she told me everything. I didn't confront my mother again about the lullaby for several months. I needed time to process what I'd learned, to understand the complexity of what she'd done. But the knowledge sat with me, changing how I thought about everything. Every time I remembered my mother singing that lullaby, the memory transformed. What had seemed like a simple, sweet bedtime ritual became an act of radical strength. And then, one day, I was at a therapist's office. I'd started seeing someone after finding the journal. And something shifted. My therapist asked me to sing the lullaby, to recite the lyrics out loud. As I did, I started crying. Not from sadness, but from a strange sense of gratitude that I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. "Your mother," my therapist said carefully, "encoded her survival into something that would be sung to you every night. Do you understand what that means?" "That she was traumatized?" I said. "Yes, but also that she was determined. She was saying, every single night, 'I survived this, I'm still here, and I'm passing my strength to you.' That's not a trauma lullaby. That's a survival anthem." After that session, I called my mother and asked if she'd be willing to talk about it. Really talk about it. Not just confirm what the journal said. She agreed, but she asked if we could do it while she made her famous pot roast. "I think better when I'm cooking," she said. "And I think you'll need something warm and grounding." We sat at her kitchen table and she told me the full story. How she'd been abducted by someone she'd met at a party, someone who seemed harmless until they weren't. How he'd driven her to an abandoned house in the countryside. How she'd managed to escape by convincing him she needed to use the bathroom, then running through the back door and flagging down a passing car. "I never reported it because I was ashamed," she said. "I felt like I'd made a mistake by getting into a car with him. I felt like it was my fault, and he'd told me that if I reported it, he'd come back for me or my family. I believed him. I was terrified." "So you encoded it instead," I said. "So I encoded it," she confirmed. "I went to a songwriter friend, someone who worked with codes and ciphers for fun, and I explained what I needed. Not the full story, just enough for her to understand the concept. And together we created the lullaby. Every word, every phrase, it meant something specific. A detail, a location, a time. And then I sang it to you, every single night, until the day you turned 13, and I decided you were old enough that you didn't need a bedtime song anymore." "Why did you stop?" I asked. "Because you were old enough to ask questions if you wanted to. Because I thought you would find the journal someday when you were ready. And because—" She paused, tears in her eyes. "Because I wanted you to know that it was possible to survive something terrible and still build a beautiful life. I wanted you to see that I wasn't broken by what happened. I was just different." I reached across the table and held her hand. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about the trauma or the secrecy or the weird complexity of growing up with an encrypted message woven into my childhood. I was just thinking about my mother. How brave she was, how determined, How she'd taken something unspeakable and transformed it into something that could be sung, something that could be shared without causing harm. "Thank you," I said, "for surviving, for being strong enough to do that, for choosing to make yourself heard even if it had to be in code." She squeezed my hand. "Thank you for listening, for understanding, for finding the journal and asking questions instead of just letting it go." After that conversation, I made a decision. I decided to write down the full story of the lullaby, not the coded details of my mother's assault, but the story of how she transformed trauma into art, how she created a secret message of survival and sang it to her daughter every night. And I decided to share it with others because I realized that so many people are walking around with encrypted truths, with stories they're afraid to tell, with trauma they've learned to hide. But what if we didn't have to hide? What if we could transform our pain into something beautiful, something that could be shared and understood by the people who love us? I've sung the lullaby to myself as an adult, and now I understand it differently. It's not a song about trauma. It's a song about survival. It's a message from my mother saying, "I was taken, but I wasn't broken. I was silenced, but I found a way to be heard. I was afraid, but I was brave." Last year, I did something my mother never did. I reported the assault. The statute of limitations had long passed, but the police officer who took my statement said it didn't matter. What mattered was that my mother's truth was finally being acknowledged by someone other than her. Her voice was finally being heard, even if it was 4 decades late. The man who abducted her was dead by then, so there could be no prosecution. But there was acknowledgement. There was a record. There was an official statement that said, "This woman survived, this woman was believed." My mother cried when I told her, not sad tears, but the kind of tears that come when you've been holding something in for so long that finally releasing it feels like flying. I've thought a lot about what it means to grow up with a secret like this. I've thought about how every mother is encoding messages to her children. Messages about who she is, what she values, what she survived. And I've realized that my mother's lullaby was her way of saying, no matter what happens to me, remember this. Remember that I survived. Remember that I chose to keep going. Remember that I loved you enough to protect the truth. That's what the lullaby taught me in the end. Not to be afraid of the dark parts of our history, but to find ways to transform them into something that can be sung. To find ways to make our survival into a melody that can be shared and remembered and passed on. My mother is 72 now. Sometimes she still hums that lullaby while she's doing dishes, and every time I hear it, I don't think about the kidnapping or the trauma or the fear. I think about a young woman, 18 years old, who survived something terrible and decided that she would never be silenced, who created a code, who sang a secret, who transformed pain into a gift for her daughter. And I think about how that lullaby taught me, long before I understood its meaning, that the most powerful thing we can do is survive, and the second most powerful thing is to let people know that we did.